Sea of Stars is a good game, and for a second effort from a small independent developer, it's incredibly impressive. But Sabotage Studios still has a lot to learn when it comes to dialogue, character development, and how to structure an epic tale. And even though the game was meant to be a spiritual successor to Chrono Trigger, Sea of Stars fails to heed some of the most important lessons from its famous predecessor. Just to be clear, this video will have massive spoilers for every single aspect of this game, and there might also be a couple of spoilers for Chrono Trigger along the way, but I've tried to keep them to an absolute minimum. Before I say anything else, let me just get the obvious thing out of the way. Sea of Stars has some of the most gorgeous pixel art I've ever seen. Heroes and monsters are beautifully drawn and flawlessly brought to life with just enough animation frames to give them that retro, handcrafted feel. But as good as the characters look on screen, the star of the show is really the game's environments. Every single scene, from the creeping mist of the cursed woods to the turquoise paradise of the coral cascades and the lush vegetation of the jungle path, is a work of art. The areas are drawn in warm colors and are dense with details like bubbling streams, wind-swept grasses, and startled birds that take to flight at the hero's approach. Dynamic lighting gives the scenes a depth and warmth you wouldn't normally see in a 2D title, making the game's environments feel super inviting. It's in the light that plays along the walls as you explore the Forbidden Cave, the oppressive shadows that cling to the town of Lucent, and the shimmering refractions that play over the underwater abodes of the Kari village. Every area in the game makes great use of dynamic lighting, and the attention to detail is sometimes incredible. The shadow cast by the elevator in the harsh industrial light as you ride it out of the derelict factory is the kind of detail that blows me away. Sea of Stars is beautiful, but it also has a very deliberate look, an aesthetic carefully crafted to provoke a specific reaction from a certain group of people. Those of us who get weak-kneed with sentimental memories whenever someone brings up Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, or Terranigma. And Sea of Stars looks exactly like I remember those games looking back in the day when they were cutting edge. Of course, to really get that nostalgia flowing, you need to hit the right notes. And nothing the team could have done to hype this game up could have ever come close to the absolute coup they pulled off in securing the services of the legendary Yasunori Mitsuda as a guest composer. Mitsuda's involvement adds a lot to Sea of Stars' soundtrack. Serenade of Respite, Symphony of Shadowed Halls, and Way of the Rogue are absolute bangers, with Mitsuda's fingerprints all over the tracks. But as welcome as these guest pieces are, Sea of Stars doesn't actually need them, because the game's main composer, Eric W. Brown, also known as Rainbow Dragon Eyes, did an absolutely outstanding job. The area themes add a lot of character to the game's environments. The combat tracks are catchy and energetic. And the Super Nintendo-inspired sound gives Sea of Stars a classic vibe. My first impression was not amazing, but the more I played, the more it snuck up on me. I hung around the derelict factory to bask in its synthwave goodness, made extra trips back to Repine to take in its dystopian fantasy, and found myself humming the Clockwork Castle theme while I wasn't playing the game. Sea of Stars' soundtrack is not god tier, but it's very good. And while several of my favorite tracks from the game are pieces contributed by Mitsuda, the highest praise I could possibly give is that a lot of Brown's own work is at least in the same league. And when you can hang with one of the all-time greats of video game music history without embarrassing yourself, it's a sign of talent indeed. Sea of Stars delivers great visuals and solid audio, but what the game does best is putting it all together to set a scene. The miserable bog of Necromancer's lair, the chiseled dwellings of the stonemason's outpost, and the sterile installations of Skybase are all evidence of the game's sense of fantasy and adventure in full bloom. But the greatest triumph of the game's presentation is something much more subtle. Something that speaks to the sheer depth of the love and attention that was put into crafting this experience. The performance of the pirate band on the stage of the world's taverns is such a ridiculously cool feature. Including acoustic remixes for dozens of the game's musical tracks just to let you enjoy them through your own private jukebox is kind of insane. And the fact that the individual instruments fall silent while you're chatting with the respective performer is a detail that put my jaw on the floor when I finally noticed. But this attention to detail isn't just true of the game's presentation. It also carries through into what is arguably the most important aspect of the game. Because Sea of Stars areas are not just gorgeous, they're also very fun to explore. Sea of Stars does something clever right from the start. It throws you straight into its world and gives you a taste of exploration gameplay before pulling you into the story. Which was absolutely the right choice, because Sea of Stars has some of the best level design I've ever seen. Navigation is intuitive, the character's interaction with the terrain is smooth, and exploring the game's environments just feels incredibly satisfying. Climbing cliffs, scaling ladders, jumping across platforms, walking tightropes, and creeping along narrow ledges adds a sense of immersion and the feeling of being inside the environment rather than observing it from the outside. These elements are nothing new, but where modern games like Final Fantasy XVI use them as miniature cutscenes that hide loading screens, in Sea of Stars they feel like a natural interplay between the characters and the environment. Where other games often fail to sell the illusion that the boundaries that surround you are part of the world you explore, Sea of Stars gives the impression that everything you see can also be touched. The way you explore the devastated town of Brisk by climbing across debris, partially collapsed buildings, and waterlogged rubble really drives home just how clever the game's level design can sometimes be. Here, you're not just walking down a disguised hallway, you're exploring a living diorama. And because every part of the environment is interactive, even linear stages seem full of choices. Sea of Stars makes exploration fun, even when you're only following a path. Finding your way is never all that hard, but it still feels rewarding to do. And a lot of this comes from attention to detail. The pixel-perfect presentation of the areas, the careful contouring of different elevations, and the precise timing of running, climbing, and jumping. It's all been carefully calibrated to feel good. The best time I had with Sea of Stars was spent exploring the game's dungeons. The wind tunnels mine, the derelict factory, and the underwater tower of Antsudlo are just a few of the many dungeons that kept me fully immersed throughout the experience. There's just enough branching paths to make pathfinding feel fun, without ever getting frustrating. And many of the game's areas strike an awesome balance between navigation, puzzle solving, and combat. But there are exceptions. I personally would have liked to spend more time solving problems and less time fighting monsters. I had a ton of fun with the game's puzzles, but they really could have done a lot more with them. One of the best feelings in a Metroidvania-style game is when the tools and abilities you pick up along the way become part of your everyday arsenal. It's the difference between finding a key that opens a single door and mastering a power that's useful in countless situations. Sea of Stars isn't exactly a Metroidvania, but it kind of builds on the same principle. And the game messes this up a lot of the time. Out of all the powers you get in Sea of Stars, only the grappling hook really nails this design. It's a multi-purpose tool that remains useful in many situations. It's not just for getting across gaps, but also for pulling handles, grabbing ladders, and getting the jump on monsters. The grappling hook is always useful, and the game never lets you forget it. But this is not true of the other tools. The Solstice Amulet lets you control the passage of time whenever you want, instead of only when you're standing on certain tiles. This could have made for a great payoff, but by the time you get it, you haven't actually used this power for many hours. And the Mistral Bracelet has a lot of applications, but when at one point I needed it to move a crate in the ruins of Brisk, it had been so long since I'd used it, I forgot it was even a thing. And outside of the place where you get it, the Cobalt Hammer is only used a single time. But as poorly as each of these tools are handled, the bigger issue is how they all fit together, because the game leaves a lot on the table when it comes to its puzzle design. The Grapploo, Mistral Bracelet and Solstice Amulet are all fun to work with on their own, but they're even cooler when you get to combine them. The puzzle that opens the door to the Solstice Shrine on Sarai's world is a great example of just how interesting the game's problems can be when the different elements all come together. But Sea of Stars almost never takes advantage of this potential. The fundamental design is so strong, but they could have done so much more with it. And the same can be said for how Sea of Stars handles the key innovation it took from the game that inspired it. Just like in Chrono Trigger, the legendary Japanese RPG that Sabotage Studios was channeling when they made Sea of Stars, exploration and combat take place in the same environments, with no transition between the two major game modes. Having the monsters visible on the screen as you explore adds to immersion, lets you choose how and when to approach combat, and plays well with the game's emphasis on pathfinding and puzzle solving. But there are some problems with Sea of Stars' implementation of this mechanic, because the game's encounters aren't as optional as they first might seem. This is something that kept nagging at me the more I played, but it became especially clear in the game's most frustrating area. Having to navigate battles with only 2 characters in the air elemental Skyland was by far the most difficult part of Sea of Stars, and some of the fights in this area can be very unforgiving. At first, I thought this setup might have been the game's way of saying I should be taking advantage of the flexible encounter system to bypass those nasty battles without a fight. Instead, the lesson I learned was exactly the opposite. Because even though Sea of Stars doesn't have any random encounters, the fact of the matter is that a lot of the game's encounters are unavoidable. Many of the battles you fight are ambushes, and the path forward is often locked behind mandatory fights. But the worst part is that even when the encounters are optional, it's usually smarter to fight anyway. Where Chrono Trigger usually made it fairly easy to avoid optional battles, and even had some clever setups where you could apply a bit of quick thinking to dispatch the enemies without fighting, Sea of Stars makes you work a lot harder to dodge its monsters. Not to mention that the penalty for failing to slip past a group of enemies is also a lot more severe, since you'll be giving up a chance for a sneak attack that will let you start the battle at a huge advantage. Chrono Trigger's encounter system was brilliant for its time, because it put the choice to fight in your hands. Sea of Stars took this structure, but doesn't seem to understand what made it work. It might not seem like such a big deal, because let's be honest, at the end of the day, most players will end up clearing the monsters out anyway. Especially since the game is so generous with the placement of campfires, and most enemies are gone forever once you've knocked them off. But the point isn't whether you fight or don't fight. The point is to make it feel like it's up to you. But this is something I could have ignored if it wasn't for another problem. Sea of Stars doesn't innovate on this game mechanic in any real way. There's a lot of stuff they could have done to play around with this format, especially given how interactive and traversable the game's environments are. What if you could drop blocks of stone on the monsters from above, or use the Mistral Bracelet to push weaker enemies into a pit? How about lowering a portcullis to split a nasty group of monsters into 2, letting you pick them off one by one? And wouldn't it be cool to sneak past the enemies to throw a lever that collapses the bridge they're standing on? And imagine if these actions would actually credit you with the monster's destruction, rewarding you with XP and gold as if you had defeated them in combat. Chrono Trigger had some really creative ambushes and fun encounter setups, and it played with the format throughout the game. Sea of Stars' take on this tried and true formula just kinda pales in comparison. The game had so many opportunities to do something interesting with its encounter mechanic, and I was honestly really excited to see what they do to shake things up. So the fact that they didn't is a big letdown. But while Sea of Stars fails to innovate on the structure of its encounters, once you're actually in a fight, it's a totally different story. Sea of Stars has one of the most interesting turn-based combat systems I've ever seen. The interplay between different options with skills, combos, and ultimates all requiring a different resource makes for a powerful synergy. especially since what ties it all together is how the game handles standard attacks. Where most RPGs tend to treat this option as an inferior backup when you're unable or unwilling to spend a limited resource, Sea of Stars' standard attacks are an integral part of the character's arsenal. Unlike skills and combos, standard attacks generate the MP and live mana you need to stay competitive, and knowing when and where to squeeze one in is a crucial part of a winning strategy, especially when it comes to the most important feature of the game's combat system. Enemies preparing special attacks display a bar with different locks, which can be broken by dealing damage of the specified type. Breaking locks weakens the enemy's attack, and breaking them all will completely cancel it. Successful lock breaking is key to crushing the enemies, but since you only have a limited number of turns to work your magic, and there's often multiple monsters competing for your attention, figuring out how to break them all makes every battle a kind of puzzle. You can't do everything, so you often have to prioritize, but when you actually do manage to shut the monsters out completely, it's an incredibly satisfying feeling. I'm also impressed with the way the game handles turn order in combat. Each of your 3 characters have to take their turn before the same character can act again, but you decide the order they go in. And since the enemies operate on a separate track of timers that count down every time one of the heroes makes their move, the way you line up your actions can make a huge difference. Clever manipulation of the turn order is a key aspect of doing well in combat, which is something I always enjoy. And since combat is built around the lock-breaking system, I love that you get to swap your party members in the middle of combat at no cost, adding an extra layer to this strategy. Especially since Sea of Stars lets you choose which of the 2 characters will spend their turn on performing a combo, which opens up tons of avenues for clever tactics. Besides the intellectual exercise of figuring out the best way to spend your turns, the game's combat also includes an element of player skill. Battles are full of situations where timing is super important. A good sense of rhythm lets you bounce Valyr's Moonerang or sustain Sarai's Poison Dart Flurry for much longer. Zale's Sunball does maximum damage if you nail the timing, and most importantly, pressing a button at just the right moment lets you parry enemy attacks or strike twice when attacking. Every enemy has its own attack pattern and specific timing window to defend against it, adding an element of experimentation and mastery to combat. And learning how to parry a tricky multi-hit attack can be very rewarding, especially when that same attack shows up later, and you get to feel like a boss for already knowing how to defeat it. Not everyone enjoys skill-based elements in their turn-based combat, and I totally get that, but I personally found this feature to be super engaging. The fact that the game's equivalent to a critical hit is a matter of timing instead of luck is a lot of fun, and there were plenty of times in my playthrough where a single button press proved the difference between winning and losing. Some of the most fun I had with Sea of Stars was taking on the game's fantastic bosses. These cleverly designed encounters force you to really think about how to use your resources wisely to overcome the challenge. Between managing MP and live mana, healing your party, and breaking the enemy's locks, there's a constant stream of tiny little choices for you to make. The outcome of combat is always in your hands, and the best designed battles kept me thoroughly engaged, mind-boiling with real-time analysis on how to keep my characters alive while dealing with enemy locks and dishing out damage. When combat is at its best, the sheer sense of flow is just insane. But the same thing that makes these climactic battles so much fun can also be a source of great frustration, because most of the time you spend fighting in this game will be against much less significant opponents, and regular battles can get kind of tedious. Chrono Trigger is a timeless masterpiece, but it's not a perfect game. And one of the main criticisms that can be leveled against the classic title is the fact that the majority of the battles you fight require no strategy whatsoever. Sea of Stars' clever combat system provides one possible solution to this problem. Its puzzle-like approach to battles, coupled with the relatively modest pace at which the characters grow in power, means that even ordinary enemies must be taken seriously. But there is an obvious downside to this design. The amount of effort the game asks you to put into defeating even the most mediocre minion means that fighting takes a lot of energy. So the game works best when you're only called into combat every now and then. And while I never felt like the battles truly bored me, there were parts of the game where I started to feel kind of worn down from having to fight the same set of enemies over and over. But it's not just a matter of how often you do battle. It's also about the repetitive nature of some of its encounters. Because even though the game's combat system has an amazing foundation, Sea of Stars doesn't always live up to that potential. Lock breaking is a fantastic idea, but the way it's implemented comes with some major flaws. A lot of locks cannot be broken without delaying the opponent's turn, which puts far too much emphasis on a short list of tools limited to Sarai and Roshan. Delaying an opponent's turn is great as a tactical fallback in a tough situation, but it gets kinda silly when a boss keeps spamming locks that are out of reach without it. The game also leans too hard on combos when designing locks, which is a bit of a problem since you're not guaranteed to have them. The opportunity to snatch up new combos as treasure makes exploration more fun, but it kinda sucks when you missed that one combo you absolutely need to cancel a boss's special attack. But these are fairly minor complaints compared to a bigger issue. Lock breaking is all about finding ways to deal the right kind of damage, and there were many times throughout this game where I felt seriously restricted in this regard. For example, Valeer is your only source of lunar damage, and for a good portion of the journey, she's also your only character with a blunt weapon. You can sometimes get around these limitations by using the combo system, but the option to swap a character's weapon type or choose from a broader pool of available skills would have made it possible to tailor your team to your preferred playstyle, instead of playing the game strictly as the devs intended. And I think this would have made the experience a lot more fun. Another way to solve this issue would have been to make a fairly simple tweak to an existing feature. While the general idea of live mana generated by striking an enemy with a standard attack is quite solid and really plays well into the whole lock-breaking mechanic, I still think the design is a bit undercooked. It would have been a lot more interesting if each character generated live mana of their own element, allowing other characters to use it on their turn. This would have let you bank up lunar mana to use when Valeer isn't available, or attack with Beast and then follow up with Sarai for a rare slashing arcane combination. It would have meant a totally different approach to how locks are designed, but it could have been really cool. The game could have also done more with positioning. There are situations where it matters. Zale's Sunball attack is great on clumped up enemies, certain skills can reposition monsters on the field for a better setup, and Valeer's Moonerang is considerably harder to keep alive when you're at an awkward angle. But for the most part, positioning feels like a pointless gimmick, and I never really felt like it made enough of a difference to feel like a core part of the game's combat. Still, while there are some things Sabotage could have done to make Sea of Stars battles even more fun, the game's combat system is still top tier. And combined with stellar presentation and great level design, the core gameplay on offer is extremely solid. However, it pains me to say that my feelings are much more mixed when it comes to the game's story. Compared to The Messenger, Sabotage Studios' first game, Sea of Stars is a much more ambitious title when it comes to its narrative. The game has some fun characters, some interesting ideas, and a great sense of epic adventure. It's a story that follows well-worn paths rather than blazing new trails, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with playing to expectations when you do it right. And for the most part, Sea of Stars does just that. There are parts of the story that really shine, and where Sea of Stars delivers a fantastic experience. The hero's adventure on Wraith Isle, the passage through the Sea of Stars, and the journey through the Sacrosanct Spires are all terrific scenarios. And there were moments in the game where all of the pieces of the puzzle came together to deliver the exact kind of feeling I wanted from this experience, like the point where the game's anonymous narrator suddenly steps into the story, the chilling setup that introduces the Dweller of Dread, or the scene where Rishon discovers the truth about Ephorul's gift. And honestly, the arrival on Sarai's world and finally finding out what she's been hiding from the heroes all this time was a great twist that took me completely by surprise. There are also parts of the story that work very well as standalone adventures. The troubles at the stonemason's outpost, the quest to claim the Vespertine from the clutches of its jealous captain, and the infiltration of Skybase to shut down the Catalyst are all enjoyable sequences with a lot of charm and great ambience. But where the game really struggles is in putting it all together into a cohesive whole, because ultimately Sea of Stars fails to take a key lesson from the game that inspired it. One of the main reasons why Chrono Trigger is such an amazing experience comes down to a very simple fact. The game doesn't waste time. Chrono Trigger has incredible pacing, delivering its story at breakneck speed through a series of lively set-piece scenarios, none of which ever overstay their welcome. It only needs half an hour to plunge the player knee-deep into the hero's quest to save the future. And the rest of the game is a whirlwind of memorable locations, dramatic scenarios, and epic moments. It only takes about 20 hours to do everything in the original version of this game, meaning that most people are going to be left hungry for more by the time it's over. And just to make sure there's no confusion here, that's a good thing. By contrast, Sea of Stars gets off to a very slow start. The early game kind of stumbles from adventure to adventure without any good hooks, and it's only when Sarai joins the party on Wraith Isle that the story really starts to heat up. That's more than 6 hours into the game, and even though the story picks up considerably from this point on, its issues with pacing are far from over. After a marvelous sequence on Wraith Isle, the game sends you on a long detour before you're able to go after the Dweller of Strife, including a major sidetrack in order to found the game's Kickstarter stretch goal town, a process that adds very little to the main story and should have probably been made an optional part of the game. And instead of getting permission to enter the Sea of Stars by completing a bizarre and totally arbitrary task, opening the path between worlds should have really been about unlocking the true power of the Vespertine, since it just happens to be the only vessel capable of making the transit, that the heroes conveniently already own. I get that this was all about Garl, but his sacrifice could have come in a better integrated part of the story instead of a filler episode. Reaching Sarai's world breathed new life into a dying story for me, and I honestly think this point should have come a lot earlier. It took me about 40 hours to finish the game, including all of the major optional content. And at the risk of angering people, I don't think this game needed to be that long. We didn't need the hero's whole backstory before entering the first dungeon. We also could have done without a 30-minute tutorial to teach us the basics of exploration and combat. Sea of Stars could have opened with showing the confrontation with the Dweller of Woe, then flashed back for an hour or two to set everything up, and the game would have been off to a running start. By abbreviating the first 5 hours and trimming the fat between Wraith Isle and Sarai's world, Sea of Stars could have been a lean 25-30 hour experience that left players begging for more. Just like Chrono Trigger before it. But the structural problems with Sea of Stars' story aren't limited to its pacing. The game also struggles with providing a proper foundation for its best moments. The most impactful parts of the game's story are those that get the best build-up. The confrontation with the Dweller of Woe feels like the perfect capstone to the hero's adventure on Wraith Isle. After hearing so many stories about the infamous Fleshmancer and seeing his horrible works, the first meeting with Ephorul feels appropriately momentous, and the sequence of events that play out at the top of the Sacrosanct Spires is a great culmination to a carefully laid plot. But many of the game's other story beats could have done with a bit more setup. The gorilla matriarch and the whole idea of divine spirits feels like it comes out of nowhere. The Flask of Borrowed Time is just one example of the game using prophecy as a crutch, instead of doing the work to set up a plot point. And the big moment when the Solstice Warriors return the moon to the sky above Sarai's world should have been this super hype moment, except that the build-up just wasn't there. part of the issue is that the game puts a lot of its best world building, plot development, and backstory in the wrong place. Sea of Stars continues the studio's tradition of including optional stories told by an in-game character, but where the messenger stories were funny diversions or thought-provoking morals that could be enjoyed outside of the game's narrative, the stories collected and retold by Teeks in Sea of Stars are all intimately connected to the game's world and the history of many of its characters. This sounds great in theory, but it's a bit of a problem in practice, because the tales you hear from Teeks should have really been part of the main story, and holding this information back as optional content makes the game's narrative that much weaker. The Sacrosanct Spires would have been even better if the story of Tekor and the Failsafe had unfolded as a mystery throughout the experience. The Dweller of Woe would have made a much more interesting villain if you'd known about Duke Aventry and Ewilda before you faced her, and learning the whole backstory of Kale and the kids before you even set foot inside the Clockwork Castle kinda gives the whole thing away in advance. But these are far from game-breaking issues, and the part of the story that could have used the most work is something much more fundamental. Sea of Stars struggles to build tension because it lacks engaging antagonists. The 4 nameless acolytes are paper-thin excuses to add some opposition, and they never do anything especially worthwhile. These goons could have easily been cut without affecting the story, and that's a pretty bad sign when you're looking for drama. More importantly, I felt absolutely nothing for the game's most important villains. Brugave's and Erlina's betrayal was a nice surprise, but the twist would have hit that much harder with the proper foreshadowing. The stab in the back from the hero's mentors never really seemed motivated to me, and even after getting their full backstory, I still don't understand what their deal was. I get that they were unhappy with their lot in life, but why did they need to destroy the world? And if they didn't want to be Solstice warriors, why not just leave and go somewhere else? Obviously they couldn't do so as children, but once they were grown, who could have stopped them from leaving? Given how much time the game spent on an early flashback to flesh out the hero's childhood, they really should have managed a stronger relationship between them and their mentors, because this betrayal should have really hurt. And the lack of a solid connection makes Erlina's role as the ultimate antagonist in the normal ending feel pretty much pointless. The only good villain the game has is Aforul, and his complicated relationship with Reshan was one of the highlights of the whole story. But for all the time Sea of Stars spends hyping the Fleshmancer up throughout the journey, he really doesn't play that large a role in the game's story. Still, the biggest problem with Sea of Stars isn't pacing or build-up. Even a mediocre plot can make a powerful story if it can deliver great characters. And that's where the game takes its biggest tumble. For all the simplicity of its central story, Sea of Stars clearly wants to be an emotional roller coaster. And while I'm well aware there's plenty of people out there who found the game's pivotal moments shocking, exciting, and incredibly touching, that wasn't the case for me. Because Sea of Stars characters never managed to grab me. Some of it has to do with the game's tone, and this is very much a matter of personal preference. Sea of Stars tries for that trademark JRPG mix of the dramatic and the comedic, but the game doesn't quite manage to strike the balance. The result is that even though Sea of Stars deals with some pretty heavy stuff, it comes off as a very light-hearted story. The game's emphasis on comedy means the story struggles to land its most critical moments. Garl's death is clearly meant to be the game's most important scene, but honestly, I just didn't feel it. And I know that's on me, but I can't be the only one out there who has a hard time getting emotional about a quest where you terraform a volcano into a giant oven so you can bake the world's largest loaf of bread to wake an ancient dragon and convince him to start a career in catering. I get why some people like this, but it wasn't for me. Other problems with the story have less to do with personal preference. Like, Sea of Stars has a problem with dialogue. Conversations can run a bit long, there's a lot of repeated information, and the exposition can be pretty heavy-handed. The way the characters talk often comes across jarring, and while the writing never gets bad enough to ruin the experience, it often took me out of the moment. And I can't help but feel that hiring a professional editor to look over the final text would have been money well spent. Still, I would have happily given the quality of the writing a pass if it wasn't for one thing. The game's twin protagonists are its least interesting characters. It's clear that there was a genuine intention to differentiate between the two heroes, and the story sometimes goes out of its way to tell us just how different Valere and Zale are. But this is never shown in the way they act. And if the two heroes had switched colors and weapons midway through the game, I probably wouldn't even have noticed. It's really a shame, because they clearly know how to write interesting characters. Garl, Serai, Beast, and Resh'an all have lots of personality and feel very distinct, but in giving all of the good parts to the supporting cast, they ended up leaving almost nothing for the two central heroes to say or do. For the first half of the game, Garl is the one who acts as protagonist, and honestly, when he dies, he leaves a massive Garl-shaped hole in the story. Garl was the heart of the party, and it's only when Beast joins up that things start to get better again. The way to fix this would have been to give Zale and Valere a bit of character development. I spent 40 hours with these people, and the only thing I could tell you about them is that they hate Dwellers and love Garl. I really would have liked to see more focus on the relationship between them, with some kind of obstacle for them to overcome that would make their eventual triumph that much more rewarding. What if Valere and Zale started out struggling to work as a team? Maybe they are too different, and they're always at odds, while Garl has to constantly play the peacemaker. Then, only after he dies, they finally learn the lesson he's been trying to teach them, and grow to appreciate each other in a new way. Still, after a rocky start, Sea of Stars finds its feet and eventually delivers a solid adventure. It's not a story for the ages, but in its best moments, it's really good. To me, the strongest part of the whole game was everything related to the Sacrosanct Spires. The way the story unfurled through multiple areas and intriguing cutscenes, the wonderful mood, the subtle world building. This was a truly great story arc, and it felt like the most well-crafted part of the story, even down to the dialogue. It's simple, yet elegant, and absolutely charming. And it's proof that Thierry Boulanger can write a great story. And if the entire game had been just like this, I wouldn't have had much of anything to complain about. Which is very good news for whatever project Sabotage Studios takes on next, as long as they find a way around Sea of Stars' prequel problem. Before I go on, I just want to say if you enjoyed this video, I'd be super grateful if you could hit the like button and leave a quick comment, as it really helps the video reach more people. I read every comment I get, no matter how old the video is. And if you want to support me, consider subscribing to my channel so I know people want to see more videos like this. It's no great secret that Sea of Stars is an unabashed love letter to Chrono Trigger, and the game takes plenty of inspiration from the legendary Super Nintendo game. The turn-based battles with their focus on two character combos and enemy positioning, the way encounters work, and of course the gorgeous pixel art environments, the aesthetic of the world map, and the music that all evoke that classic vibe. And then there's all the clever references to Chrono Trigger's world and story. The wanderer on the cliff who gives you a small gift if you pester him long enough. The frog enemy that uses a slurp kiss attack. A floating kingdom in the sky. A scene where you travel back to a moment frozen in time to save a companion, and even a final battle that feels like a straight-up homage to Chrono Trigger's Queen Zale. But for better or worse, there is another game that's left an even stronger mark on Sea of Stars. Sabotage Studios' very own The Messenger. Well before the game released, Sabotage Studios hinted that Sea of Stars was a prequel, set in the same universe as their first game. And as intriguing as this statement was, those of us who had played Sabotage's tongue-in-cheek tribute to 80s NES action titles like Ninja Gaiden and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were scratching our heads trying to figure out what the new game could possibly have in common with the 2D platformer. Although there is a direct story link between Sea of Stars and The Messenger, it's mostly presented as a series of Easter eggs for fans of the earlier game. But even though these are indirect references with very little impact on the story of Sea of Stars, they actually leave a pretty large footprint on the gameplay experience as a whole, which can be kind of a problem. while I appreciate the many little nods to the messenger, like the teleporting wizard enemies, a character who tells you stories, the presence of time shards, and the shrine from the game's ending, some of the more significant connections can feel pretty intrusive. The fact that Mesa Island is the same island the messenger is set on is pretty cool, and realizing that Autumn Hills is a faithful screen-for-screen recreation of the same zone from the previous game is kind of a trip. But I still think they went too far. The messenger-inspired areas feel somehow off compared to the rest of the world, and the remixed tracks are so different from the style and tone of the Sea of Stars soundtrack, it came across jarring. I'm not saying I don't like the music, I'm just saying it doesn't fit. The story of Brugaves also felt kind of shoehorned into the game in order to set up the payoff for his appearance in The Messenger, and the 4 acolytes make sense once you realize their connection to the previous game, but they feel completely inconsequential to the Sea of Stars story. In the end, I honestly think the devs went too far in setting up links to the earlier title, and it sometimes comes at the expense of Sea of Stars. I get that people find these callbacks super fun, but I personally think this would have been a better game if they hadn't tried so hard to fit it into the Messenger verse. If they wanted to make the 2 games connected, they should have made it an integral part of the story instead of forcing a square peg into a round hole. Sea of Stars is far from perfect, but considering the size of the team, the fact that it's an indie studio, and the budget involved, it's pretty darn impressive. Many of the game's weaker points can probably be chalked up to these factors, although to be completely frank, there really aren't a lot of AAA studios out there who could have done a better job than this. Sea of Stars isn't just good for an indie game. It's one of those rare indie titles like Hollow Knight or Axiom Verge that transcend the hobbyist scene to take their place in the canon of legitimately good games. Even if Sabotage Studios still has a ways to go to reach the very top. There's plenty of stuff that could be improved the next time around, but everyone involved in this production should be very proud of their work. This is what game design should be all about. A small, dedicated team of passionate companions making a run at something they truly care about, and making something closer to a work of art than a commercial product. And mainstream gaming hasn't been about that since the mid-90s. Anyway, I'm just some guy on YouTube, and these are just my personal opinions. Whether you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear about your experiences with Sea of Stars in the comments below. And to those of you who support my own passions, I'm very grateful for the love. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.